The news reached her like a cold wind through a thin shawl. Eliza stood at the doorway of her family's small cabin, fingers tight around the frame as if the wood might keep life from changing. The messenger's voice was steady and formal, but his eyes slid away from hers when he spoke the name of the man she was to marry. A Blackfeet warrior known across valleys and trading posts, a man people called the most feared. A man she had never met. Her mother's breath hitched. Her younger brother looked at the floor, and Eliza felt the room tilt. The messenger said the arrangement would end a dispute after a winter of frayed promises. 2 horses lost, a line of traps found broken, a cousin injured in a skirmish near the river. The elders had spoken, their words wrapped in duty and necessity, and they expected the young to carry them. This was the way peace was held together in seasons when hunger walked the edges of every camp and settlement. He finished his message, nodded once, and left without waiting for questions. As if questions had never changed a single decree, Eliza did not weep. She went to fetch water with the pail that had belonged to her grandmother. She walked the path along the creek where reeds made soft music and the earth smelled like wet iron. She knelt and saw her face trembling in the water's surface. A good face, sun-touched and steady. She told herself she would not break. She would carry her mother's tenderness and her father's careful way of thinking like talismans. She would keep her voice calm. She would be a river stone. Rounded by pressure and time, they said his name was Cato. They said he had fought to protect his people, and that there was a scar like a pale finger down his ribs. They said he rode a roan horse with a white star, and that the horse never shied at thunder. They said he could silence a quarrel with a glance. No one told Eliza the sound of his laugh or the shape of his patience. No one told her how he spoke to children, or if he thanked the women who fed him stew when nights ran long. Rumors were sharp tools. Dull truths were harder to find. On the morning she was to travel, the sky was the color of old pewter. Her mother wrapped dried apples in a small tin cup into a cloth bundle, then pressed it into Eliza's hands like a blessing. Her brother mended the strap on her satchel with quiet care. He tied it twice, then once more. As if knots could hold time still, Eliza hugged them both, each embrace a stitched piece of courage, and climbed into the trader's wagon that would carry her to the meeting place by the willow bend. The road was rutted, the wheels creaked. Around them the land breathed out autumn's cool. Golden grass leaned toward the earth and far hawks drew circles in a patient sky. The trader was a kind man with a scar of his own. His stories wore 3 coats of dust, and she listened to them without hearing. Her thoughts were walking ahead of the wagon, already at the river bend where her life would change its name. When they arrived, a thin thread of smoke rose from a small fire by the water. Cato stood with 2 older men and another woman who carried a leather pouch and a folded blanket. He was taller than she had imagined, shoulders squared like a doorframe. His hair was long, braided with 2 red beads near the end. His eyes were not the hard stones she had been warned about. They were careful and steady, and when they lifted to meet hers, Eliza felt her breath arrange itself into something she could use. No one rushed, the river talked in its soft tongue. The woman with the pouch greeted Eliza first, her voice warm as tea on a winter morning. She said her name was Apsi. She said they would eat, speak, and listen, then they would decide the shape of the day. Eliza bowed her head in thanks, and Cato inclined his. The movement was not ownership, it was greeting, plain and respectful. They shared dried meat, berries, and bannock from a flat stone warmed by coals. Apsi poured tea that tasted of mint and smoke. Eliza's hands shook once, then grew still. Cato did not stare. He watched like a person measuring weather, careful not to claim what was not his. One of the elders spoke of peace like a basket that everyone must hold if it was to keep its shape. He spoke of winter stores and the thinness of lard in bad years. He spoke of children who needed quiet nights. He asked Eliza to speak. He asked Cato to speak. He did not raise his voice. Eliza said she did not choose this road, but she would not walk it with anger. She said she understood duty, but she would not surrender the small compass inside her chest, the one that pointed toward kindness and fairness. Cato listened with his whole face, then he said he also had not chosen. He said he would not be a storm inside the home. He said he would keep the promises that kept people safe. And he would not break her voice. If peace was a basket, he would hold its rim with both hands. A hush settled like snow. It was not surrender. It was a new kind of beginning. Apsi unfolded the blanket and placed it on the ground. The elders nodded. 2 strings of shells were exchanged. A small song was sung, not for show but for steadiness. Eliza felt something ease along her spine. Not joy, not yet, but the absence of dread, a quiet space where breath could live. Cato stood beside her, not too near, not too far. His presence felt like a wall built to keep the wind from stealing the fire's heat. As the day thinned into gold, the willow leaves lifted their pale undersides to a changing wind. Eliza looked at the river and then at the man who was now her husband in the eyes of all gathered there. She did not know his stories. He did not know hers. But the rope that tied them had been braided in front of witnesses, and their hands were still their own. In the hush of that moment, Eliza decided to learn the truth of the man rather than the fear of his name. Beside her, Cato seemed to be making the same choice, a small, unseen turning, like a compass needle finding north. They left the river bend, walking side by side. No one forced their feet to keep the same rhythm, and yet they did. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. Somewhere closer, the first thin stars woke. The night would test them, so would the days that followed. But for now, the path was clear enough to put one foot and then the next and then the next. The first nights in Cato's camp were made of quiet more than sleep. Eliza lay beneath a robe that smelled faintly of pine and smoke, listening to the breathing of horses and the wind brushing the hides of the lodges. The stars were brighter than she had ever seen, close enough that they felt like thoughts forming and fading in the sky. She turned and saw Cato sitting near the fire outside, his back straight, his shadow long and still. He had not spoken more than 10 words since the ceremony, but each one had landed with the weight of meaning. The people of his band moved around her with curiosity that was soft. Not cruel, Apsi showed her how to fold her bedding, how to grind dried roots into powder for broth, and where the women washed clothes by the bend of the creek, some watched her as though waiting to see if she would cry or run. But Eliza did neither. She learned to listen to their words, the rise and fall of syllables that carried more tone than translation. The children followed her at a distance, whispering and giggling, leaving small gifts, a smooth pebble, a feather, a sprig of sage, and outside her tent each morning. Cato was gone most days before sunrise, returning at dusk with his horse lathered. His silence was not avoidance, it was a habit shaped by necessity. He moved with a kind of purpose that was old and private, but never harsh. When he spoke, it was to the elders or the young hunters, offering guidance in few deliberate sentences. Eliza watched him from the edges of her own work, studying the way he treated his horse, the way he handed food to an older man before taking his share. He carried strength like a tool, not a weapon, and that began to change the stories she had been told about him. One evening, when clouds were swollen with coming rain, Cato returned later than usual. He unsaddled his horse, rubbed its neck, and then paused near the fire. Eliza was preparing tea, her hands clumsy with new rhythm. She looked up, half expecting him to pass by. Instead, he gestured toward the pot. "Hot?" he asked, the word simple but heavy with effort. She nodded, poured some into a wooden cup, and offered it to him. Their fingers brushed. Brief as a match spark, he nodded once and sat beside the fire, the silence now shared instead of divided. After that night, small exchanges began to root between them. A question about herbs, a warning about rain, a quiet thank you. Each word was a small plank laid over the gap between two worlds. Eliza noticed that he spoke differently when he used her name. Slow, careful, as though it were a fragile bird he didn't wish to startle. And she in turn learned his language one sound at a time, repeating the words Apsi taught her, sometimes earning a small smile from Cato when she mispronounced them. Those smiles were rare, but when they came, they warmed the campfire's light. There were others in the camp who doubted this fragile peace. One man, Tala, younger than Cato but proud, questioned the joining openly. He said it was foolish to bring an outsider into their circle. His words were sharp and reckless, spoken near the horses where sound carried. Cato didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the man, long and level, until Tala's words dissolved like ash in wind. That was how Cato led, not with thunder but with the gravity of stillness. Eliza saw that and felt something loosen in her fear, not yet affection but trust trying to find a place to grow. A week later, she joined the women to gather firewood beyond the ridge. The forest there was deep and smelled of rain and cedar. When she strayed a little too far, chasing a loose branch, she lost sight of the others. The quiet grew thick, the path uncertain, and a prickle of unease rose in her chest. Then a voice, low even, called her name from behind. "Eliza!" It was Cato. His tone was not anger but concern. He had followed her trail when he saw she was missing. She turned, relief breaking through her fear. And for the first time, she smiled at him without restraint. He did not smile back, but something gentler moved in his eyes. He lifted the bundle of wood from her arms, carried it himself, and they walked back together without a word, the rhythm of their steps easy unforced that night, while the camp settled into the murmur of sleep. Eliza looked at the firelight tracing the lines of his face. She realized that Cato's silence was not emptiness. It was a kind of language, one that spoke of loss, of waiting, of choices made in seasons of danger. Apsy had told her once that he had buried a brother after a raid, that he carried guilt heavier than any blade. She understood now why his eyes watched the horizon so often, as though he were waiting for the past to come walking out of the trees. Rain began to fall, soft as breath on the lodge roof. Eliza turned toward the sound, and Cato stirred from his seat. He picked up another pelt and placed it beside her, not saying anything, just making sure the cold wouldn't reach her. Then he sat back, the fire between them. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she whispered his name, and in that small word, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding that the fear that had once built a wall was slowly turning into a bridge. Outside, the world was dark and kind. The rain kept falling, steady and sure, washing the dust from the air. Inside, two people who had begun as strangers sat breathing in the same rhythm. The silence no longer heavy, but whole. The morning came soft and cold, the air sharp enough to make breath visible. Eliza woke to the sound of horses moving beyond the lodge, hooves muffled in the earth. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her dreams still filled with the smell of rain and the warmth of firelight. Then she saw the shadow moving outside. Tall and unmistakable, it was Cato, checking the horses before dawn, his every movement measured, quiet, precise, as though he feared breaking the morning's peace. She sat up, wrapped the blanket tighter, and studied the faint mark of light cutting across his face through the tent seam. It traced the scar she had only half noticed before, a pale line running from his temple to the edge of his jaw. It was not fresh, but it held a story, one she had never been told. She found herself wondering how it had happened, who he had been before this piece had been demanded of him, before he became the man she now shared air and silence with. Later that day, while Apsy taught her how to grind corn into meal, Eliza asked about the scar in a voice careful not to tremble. Apsy's hands paused over the stone, her eyes flicked toward the open sky beyond the lodge flap. "That was from the river fight," she said softly. "The year the soldiers came early. They burned the northern camp. Cato went back for the children." Eliza listened. Heart-thudding, Apsy's voice grew quieter. "He carried two of them out, but one was his brother's boy." She didn't finish, but she didn't have to. Eliza felt the rest in the hollow behind those words. That evening, when the fire was low, Eliza gathered courage like thread in her palm. She walked to where Cato sat alone, shaping arrow shafts from straight reeds. The firelight painted his hands gold and his expression unreadable. "Apsy told me," she said quietly, "about the river." His hand stilled for a second. Then he set down the reed and lifted his eyes to her. There was no anger there, only surprise that she had spoken what most left untouched. "She talks too much," he murmured. But his voice wasn't sharp, it was tired, heavy like the last word in a long prayer. He stared into the fire for a long time. Then his voice came again, low even. "My brother was the brave one, not me," he said. "He had the heart to stand against thunder when it came. I was only supposed to watch the trail, but I went back when I heard the screams. I was too late." His words broke the rhythm of the fire. The pain inside them was old but still breathing. Eliza listened without interrupting, letting silence be the cloth that caught what could not be mended. "The scar," he continued after a pause, "was the gift the soldiers left me when they turned back." He smiled, but it was not a smile of pride, more a grim acknowledgement of a debt that would never be repaid. For a long time neither spoke. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the hide walls. Eliza reached out without thinking and touched the wooden arrow shaft he had been shaping. "You went back," she said quietly. "That is what matters." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw his guard falter, not collapse but shift like snow slipping gently from a branch. He did not thank her, but his eyes softened, and that was thanks enough. The days after that conversation carried a different rhythm. Cato began teaching her things, how to tell the time by the length of her shadow, how to listen for coyotes rather than fear them, how to braid rawhide so it wouldn't unravel in rain. He never told her why he had decided to teach, but she understood it was his way of letting her in, a small door opening in a fortress built from years of grief. In return, she taught him words in her tongue: bread, cloud peace. He repeated them with care, his deep voice stumbling over the softer consonants, sometimes laughing quietly at his own mistakes. It was a sound she hadn't expected to love, a sound that softened the corners of her loneliness. But peace in that valley was never left alone for long. One night, as they prepared for rest, a messenger arrived from the trading post near the river. His horse was sweating, eyes wide. "Soldiers," he said breathlessly. 2 days north, moving down the valley. The camp stirred like disturbed grass. Elders gathered quickly. Voices low but urgent, Cato stood among them. Tall, silent, listening, his jaw tightened. That old scar pale in the flickering light. When his eyes found Eliza's across the fire, she felt her chest tighten. The past he had buried was stirring again, and the fear of losing everything they had built, even the fragile beginnings, came rushing in like a storm. That night, neither of them slept. Cato checked his bow, his knife, the horse's saddle. He moved like a man who had walked this path before. Eliza watched him, wanting to speak but not knowing what words could fit inside the shadow of war. Finally, as he stepped outside, she said his name, Cato. He turned, and in his eyes she saw the same man who had once gone back into fire to save another. "Come back," she whispered. "Don't let the river take you again." He didn't answer, but he placed his hand over his heart, once firm, deliberate, before disappearing into the dark. When the dawn came, the world felt too still. Eliza stood by the stream, watching the reflection of the clouds drift across the water. She touched the small wooden arrow Cato had carved days before, now tucked into her belt like a charm. She whispered the word he had struggled to learn, peace, and hoped it would reach him wherever the horizon had taken him. The wind carried the scent of ash long before anyone saw the smoke. Eliza was grinding corn beside Apsy when the air shifted, heavy with the taste of burned pine and iron. The sound of distant hooves trembled through the ground like the beat of a buried drum. Around her the camp grew still, then urgent. Mothers calling to children, men gathering boughs, women packing what could be carried. The world that had begun to feel like a slow healing wound suddenly ripped open again. Apsy gripped Eliza's wrist, her voice low but steady. "Go to the creek. Wait until someone comes," but Eliza shook her head. "I can help," she said, the words slipping out before she could weigh them. The older woman's eyes softened with fear and pride. "Then listen and do not panic," she whispered, pressing a small pouch of herbs into her palm. "For wounds, or for courage, and whichever you need first." By noon, smoke rolled like a bruised cloud above the ridge. The elders' voices carried commands in firm rhythm, and Eliza saw Cato's horse before she saw him. Dust streaked its flanks, foam marked its mouth. He rode fast into camp, face dark with soot. Eyes alive with focus, he slid from the saddle, his bow still in his hand. "Scouts saw them near the timberline," he said. "A patrol, maybe 20. His voice held no fear, only a weariness that knew what must be done. The men gathered around him, and in a language Eliza only half understood, he gave orders sharp as flint. Then his gaze found hers across the fire pit. Steady and wordless, it said everything. "Be ready. Stay alive, trust me." The hours bled slow and heavy. Eliza joined the women helping to move supplies and children toward the lower valley. The little ones clutched her skirt, asking where their fathers were going. She answered the only way she could: "To keep us safe." Her heart thudded hard enough to feel in her throat. The air was thick, restless. The sound of distant thunder wasn't weather this time, it was the echo of rifles. Muted but unmistakable. Every shot felt like a needle piercing the silence she had begun to love. When night fell, the fighting drew closer. The horizon pulsed red behind the black ridge. Like a wound refusing to close, a wounded scout stumbled into camp. Bleeding from the arm, his voice cracked. "Cato still holds the pass," he said, "but they have fire." The elders ordered everyone to move deeper into the valley. But Eliza couldn't leave, not yet. Something inside her refused to turn her back. She waited until the last group disappeared into the trees, then turned toward the ridge, her heart pounding, her breath short and cold. The climb was steep, the air filled with the metallic tang of smoke and fear. She moved quietly, holding to the trees, The ground trembled with the shouts of men. Flashes of light broke the dark like angry stars. She saw them then, shapes in the firelight, Cato among them, his body moving like shadow and flame together. He fought with precision, not fury, each motion protecting, not destroying. She wanted to call out, but her voice caught when she saw a soldier break through the brush behind him. Rifle raised, without thinking, Eliza hurled a stone. It struck the man's arm. His shot went wild. Cato turned and finished the fight in a blur of motion. His eyes flicked to her, a flash of disbelief and anger, but also relief. They fell back together toward the stream, the sound of battle dimming behind them. He grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a rock. "Why did you come?" He hissed. "You should have gone with the others." She could barely breathe, smoke clawing her throat. "I couldn't leave," she said. "Not while you were there." His eyes searched hers, torn between fury and something softer. He shook his head, half in despair, half in wonder. "You are not made for this," he muttered. "Neither are you," she replied, surprising herself. "But you still fight. For a heartbeat." They just stared, two stubborn flames refusing to go out. Then came the sound that silenced everything. The high, terrible crack of fire catching dry pine. Flames leapt behind them, lighting the night like a second sun. Cato seized her hand. "Run," he said. His grip was firm, their steps uneven but determined. They crashed through brush and smoke, the forest around them hissing like a giant breath. When they finally reached the river's edge, both dropped to their knees, gasping. Soot streaked across their faces. Eliza turned to look back, the sky behind them painted in fierce orange. "You're home," she whispered. "Our people." Cato's voice came low. "Bitter homes can be rebuilt," he said. "Lives cannot," as the night deepened. The fire's glow faded into embers on the horizon. Cato sat on a rock by the river, silent, the weight of years pressing down again. Eliza crouched beside him, her hand hovering near his shoulder but not yet daring to touch. "You saved me," she said quietly. He didn't look at her. "You saved me first," he replied, almost to himself. "That makes us even." But his voice cracked on the last word. Betraying more than he wanted, she finally reached out and touched his arm. The muscles beneath were tense, trembling, his eyes closed, his breath shaking once, twice, then steadying. They stayed like that until dawn began to color the edges of the world, pink over gray. The camp was gone, but the people would return, rebuild, begin again. Eliza knew this because Cato's eyes, when he finally met hers, were not filled with defeat but with a quiet fire. "The smoke will pass," he said, almost as a promise. "It always does." She nodded, her fingers still resting against his arm. "And what remains?" she asked. His answer came slowly, like a truth long waiting to be spoken. "What remains," he said, "is who stands beside you when it burns." Morning broke with the whisper of cold wind through blackened trees. Smoke still lingered like ghosts of what had burned. The river flowed clear but restless, carrying fragments of ash downstream as if to bury the memory. Eliza stood barefoot at the edge, her reflection rippling beside Cato's shadow. The world around them had changed, smaller, quieter, heavier. The survivors had begun to return, slow and careful, faces gray with exhaustion. Each carried something of what was lost: a woven basket, a spear, a child half asleep on a hip. The camp would rise again, but the laughter that once filled its center was gone, replaced by murmurs of the wounded and the creak of rebuilding. Eliza helped where she could, bandaging burns, fetching water, grinding corn for those too weak to stand. Every small act steadied her. Though her hands never stopped trembling, Cato spent his days along the river, repairing traps, rebuilding walls, and keeping his silence like armor. When Eliza passed, he would nod but say little. His eyes, once calm and warm, now seemed fixed on some horizon she could not see. She tried to speak to him once, to ask what haunted his gaze, but the words dried in her throat. Something about the river made him different. It was as though its current carried pieces of him away each time he stood near it. That night, as moonlight silvered the broken camp, Apsy came to Eliza's tent with a bowl of steaming herbs. "Drink," she said. "It will quiet the heart." Eliza obeyed, her throat burning with the bitter taste. "He blames himself," Apsy murmured, sitting beside her. "He always has, and for the fires before, for the ones now. He believes he draws them wherever he goes." Eliza shook her head. "That's not true," she whispered. "He saved lives." It doesn't matter what truth you see," Apsy interrupted gently. It matters what truth he carries. The next morning, Eliza found him by the river again. His hands were wet, the skin of his palms raw. He was washing a charred carving, a small wooden horse, half burned, the other half still showing careful detail. "My brother carved this," he said without looking up. His voice was rough from smoke and silence. "It was for his son. The boy dropped it when the camp burned years ago. I found it this morning in the same place." He paused, water dripping from his fingers. "The river keeps what it chooses." Eliza knelt beside him, her skirt brushing the cold stones. "And what does it return?" she asked softly. He glanced at her then, the faintest curve of something between pain and gratitude crossing his face. "Not what we expect," he said. "Sometimes it gives back what we're not ready to see." His eyes lingered on hers for a heartbeat too long before he turned away, placing the small horse on a flat rock, letting the sun dry it. Days passed in strange rhythm, rebuilding, tending, waiting. At night, stories were whispered around smaller fires, of bravery and loss, of those missing and those found. Eliza began to hear her name among them, always spoken with surprise. "The outsider who stood beside him," they called her, and though she did not seek it, the respect carried a quiet warmth still. She felt the distance between her and Cato growing, like the slow widening of the river after heavy rain. One evening, as twilight wrapped the valley, Cato approached her tent, his shadow stretched long and uncertain. "Walk with me," he said simply. They followed the river until the camp was only a memory of sound behind them. The water shone like glass under the rising moon. "You shouldn't have followed me that night," he said. Not accusing, just stating, if you had died, peace would have died with you. She stopped, folding her arms against the cold. "And if you had died?" she asked. "Would peace have lived without you?" His jaw tightened, then eased. "No," he admitted, "it would not." That night she couldn't sleep. The words circled in her mind, simple but deep, a promise wrapped in hesitation. She stepped outside her lodge, the snow glowing blue under the moon. The cold bit her cheeks, but she didn't mind. Above her, the northern lights began to move, soft ribbons of green and gold dancing across the endless dark. She had never seen anything so alive, so full of quiet wonder. And as she watched, she thought of how far she had come. From a terrified girl traded for peace to a woman who had found strength in the unlikeliest heart. In the following days, the camp prepared for midwinter rites, a time of stories and remembrance. Fires burned through the night as elders spoke of old spirits, of love, and of the earth's patience. Apsi sat near the center, her voice steady, as she told of the winter hawk, a bird that carried lost souls to safety through storms. "If you see one," she said, "you are being watched over not by ghosts but by love that refuses to fade." Eliza listened, her gaze drifting to Cato across the fire, and in that moment a hawk's cry echoed faintly through the dark. Later, after the crowd thinned and embers dimmed, Cato approached her once more. "Walk with me," he said. His tone held neither command nor question, only invitation. They walked beyond the lodges, through a field of snow that shimmered beneath starlight. "I have something to show you," he said, leading her to a ridge above the frozen river. There, standing proud and still, was a totem he had carved, rough but full of life, a hawk with its wings half open. "You carved this?" she whispered, touching the cold wood. "It's for my brother," he said, "and for the child he never saw grow. I thought maybe, if it watches over the river, they'll find their way home." Eliza looked at him, her breath misting in the air. "It will," she said softly, "and maybe it will watch over you too." He turned toward her, the frost on his hair glinting like silver. "You've given me something no one else could," he said quietly. "You remind me what living feels like." She felt her throat tighten. "And you've shown me what courage looks like." For a heartbeat they simply stood there, the cold forgotten, their breath mingling between them like a shared prayer. Then, without a word, Cato reached for her. His hand cupped her cheek, rough but gentle, and for the first time she didn't flinch. Their foreheads touched, the smallest space between them filled with warmth. "When the thaw comes," he whispered, I'll take you to that meadow. We'll plant something there, not for the past, but for what's next." She nodded, unable to speak, the promise settling into her heart like a flame that would not die. As dawn broke pale over the horizon, the hawk totem cast a long shadow across the snow. The river below began to whisper beneath its frozen skin, hinting at the life waiting beneath. Eliza looked at Cato, at the man once called the most feared warrior, and saw not a legend or a ghost, but someone utterly human, strong, flawed, and real. And under that vast winter sky, they stood side by side. Two souls who had found each other not by destiny, but by choice, bound not by fear or duty, but by the quiet courage to begin again. The snow melted slow that year, as if winter itself was reluctant to leave. The river, once bound in silence, began to sing again, its ice breaking into drifting shards that caught the sunlight like glass. The valley stirred, the air filled with the scent of thawed earth and pine sap. For the first time in many months, Eliza felt warmth on her skin. Real warmth. The kind that seeps through everything heavy and reminds the soul what it means to breathe freely. Cato stood at the edge of the camp, watching the river roll wild and new. His horse pawed the softening ground, impatient to move. "It's time," he said, turning toward her. The words were simple, but in them was everything they hadn't dared to say aloud. Eliza smiled faintly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "The meadow?" she asked. He nodded. "The one I told you about, where the fish used to shine like silver coins." His voice was steady, but his eyes, those deep, unspoken eyes, carried something almost fragile, a hope he was still learning to trust. They rode for hours, the land shifting from white to green. Life burst from the soil like a long-held secret. Tiny buds pushed through thawed ground. Birds returned to the high branches. The world looked reborn, and yet so familiar. As they neared the ridge, the sound of the river faded into the hum of wind through grass, and there it was. The meadow of his stories, wide and golden under the morning light. A stream ran through its heart, clear and fast, bending like a silver thread. Cato dismounted first, his boots sinking into the damp earth. "It's smaller than I remember," he said, looking around, "but maybe that's because I was a boy when I last stood here." Eliza climbed down beside him. "Or maybe the world grew," she said gently. He smiled, a quiet, real smile that reached his eyes. Maybe it did. They walked in silence for a while, the grass brushing their hands. At the far edge of the meadow, Cato knelt, brushing snow melt from a flat patch of ground. "Here," he said. "This is where he fished." He reached into his pouch and drew out a handful of seeds, small and pale. "Wildflowers," he explained. "Apsi gave them to me before we left. She said the land remembers what is planted in love." Eliza knelt beside him, her heart full. "Then let's give it something to remember." Together they pressed the seeds into the soft soil, their fingers brushing, their breaths mingling with the scent of earth and water. When they were done, they sat side by side, watching the breeze ripple across the meadow. "He would have liked this," Cato said softly. "My brother. He was the one who taught me to fish, to listen to the wind, to fight when needed, but never without reason." Eliza looked at him, her voice quiet. "And he'd be proud that you learned when to stop fighting." He turned toward her then, eyes glinting in the sunlight. "You think I have?" She smiled. "You wouldn't be here if you hadn't." He laughed, a low, rough sound, half joy, half disbelief. "You've changed me," he said. "Before you came, I thought peace was something you won, not something you built." "Peace doesn't come to those who wait," she said. "It comes to those who stay." For a long moment, neither moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Only the whisper of wind, only the rhythm of two hearts learning the same song. Then, without ceremony, Cato reached out, his hand finding hers. Their fingers locked together, not in desperation, but in quiet certainty. "When they forced you to marry me," he said softly, I thought it was punishment. Now I see it was the beginning. Eliza's throat tightened. And I thought you were the end, she whispered. But you became my reason to start again. The afternoon sunlight stretched long across the meadow, painting them in gold. A hawk soared above, circling once before disappearing toward the horizon. Do you think Apsi's story was true? Eliza asked. That the hawk carries love through the storms? Kaito followed the bird's path with his gaze. Maybe, he said, or maybe love is what teaches us to survive the storm ourselves. They stayed until dusk, the sky turning violet and red. When the first stars appeared, Kaito stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. It will grow here, he said, looking down at the fresh earth. Not because of what we lost, but because of what we found. Eliza rose beside him, her shawl catching the evening breeze. Then let's promise, she said, that no matter what seasons come, we'll always return here, to remember. He nodded. A promise made beneath the same sky that watched us begin. He reached for her hand again, and this time she didn't hesitate. Together they stood, silent witnesses to the turning of the world. The seeds beneath their feet waited for rain, for time, for life, just as they once had, when they finally rode back toward the valley. The moon rose behind them, lighting their path in silver. The sound of the river followed, softer now, as if blessing their journey. The camp lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time in years, Kaito felt no weight pressing against his heart, only the steady beat of something new. Eliza glanced at him, her voice carried by the wind. You once said the river keeps what it chooses. Yes, he answered, eyes warm. Then maybe it chose us, she said. He smiled, the kind of smile that belonged not to a warrior or a legend, but to a man at peace. Then let it keep us, he said. And as the night wrapped them in its quiet embrace, the river flowed steady and strong, carrying their laughter, their memories, and their promise into the endless rhythm of life that would go on, long after names were forgotten but love remained.